From visually stunning action beats to strange Easter eggs, blink and you'll miss it oddities, and slivers of incredible comedy, these Star Wars moments all begged fans to hit pause and just soak them in for a minute or two. So after already bringing you one list full of must-pause Star Wars scenes, I'm Gareth, this is What Culture Star Wars, and here are 10 more of the most paused Star Wars moments. Number 10, the Holdo Maneuver, Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi. Whether you love or hate The Last Jedi, it does lay claim to one of the single coolest images in Star Wars history, when Vice Admiral Holdo pulls off the near-mythic Holdo Maneuver. In a desperate attempt to fend off the First Order fleet, and buy the Resistance precious time to escape to Crate, Holdo sacrifices herself by suicidally ramming her ship, the Raddus, into Snoke's flagship, the Supremacy, at near-light speed. The result is pure destruction. The Raddus slices through the Supremacy and obliterates the surrounding fleet. All of this depicted in eye-wateringly beautiful slow motion and near-complete silence. Every shot in this sequence as an explosive white streak tears through the First Order Armada is 100% wallpaper-worthy, but they each pass quickly enough that you'll definitely want to smash the pause button a few times and soak in each individual frame. This might well be the single most paused moment in the entire sequel trilogy, honestly, and it's not hard to see why. Number 9, Vader's scalp, Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back. Here's a moment that left a ton of Star Wars fans wearing out their VHS copy of The Empire Strikes Back in the day. The ultra-brief blink-and-you'll-miss-it glimpse of Darth Vader's exposed, burned scalp. Shortly after Luke crash lands on Dagobah, a brief scene plays out where Admiral Piet visits Vader in his meditation chamber to update him on their efforts to catch the Millennium Falcon. At the start of the scene though, we can see Vader's helmet being lowered down over his head, leaving his discolored, deeply scarred scalp visible on screen for about 2 seconds. It passes quickly enough that it practically begs fans to go back and pause to take another look. And this was surely especially true when Empire first hit VHS back in 1984. It's a tiny moment that nevertheless provided an extremely tantalizing tease of the full sans helmet Anakin reveal we'd eventually get to see in Return of the Jedi. Number 8, CGI Leia, Rogue One, A Star Wars Story. Boldly and somewhat controversially, Rogue One included not one but 2 digital recreations of Star Wars alums, Peter Cushing's Grand Moff Tarkin and Carrie Fisher's Princess Leia. Though it was publicised pre-release that a digital double of the late Cushing would be featured in Rogue One, the late film appearance of a young Leia, achieved by superimposing a CGI likeness of a young Fisher over stand-in Ingvild Dyler, was kept a secret for maximum impact. Critical and fan opinion was ultimately divided on the necessity of using not quite convincing digital trickery to recreate these characters. But at least in Leia's case, her screen time amounts to a single 7-second shot. And so the close-up of Leia's face practically invited fans to hit pause and scrutinize every last detail, looking for imperfections which gave the game away. The irony, of course, is that it looks close to perfect in a freeze frame, and the uncanny valley effect really only becomes apparent in a moving image, where the subtle movements of Leia's face just seem ever so slightly off. Still, it's certainly an impressive effort. But I want to know, what do you think is the most impressive CGI moment in all of Star Wars? You let me know in the comments section down below. Number 7, Jango Fett's Flying Head, Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. For all of its violence, Star Wars is technically a family-friendly franchise. All the Fs. And so the movies often have to sneak in their gnarliest moments in fleeting fashion. Case in point, in Attack of the Clones, we witness Jango Fett get decapitated by Mace Windu, with a swift swish of his lightsaber during the Battle of Geonosis. We very clearly see Jango's head parted from his body, though George Lucas still manages to keep the MPAA happy by showing not a drop of blood, courtesy of those wound-cauterizing lightsabers. We do, however, briefly see Jango's helmet flying through the air, and if you pause this shot, you'll see a somehow even grimmer implication. During this shot, there are actually 2 shadows on the ground, one of his helmet, the other of his decapitated head, which has seemingly slid out of the helmet and soared through the air on its own power. On one hand, it's good to know that young Boba doesn't end up cradling his own father's head when he picks up the helmet, but on the other, the idea of Jango's head flying off into the battlefield isn't a whole lot better. Number 6, Darth Luke, Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back. Of the many unforgettable moments in The Empire Strikes Back, one of the few that immediately burned itself into fans' brains was Luke's iconic trip to Dagobah's dark side cave, which in Yoda's words is a domain of evil. As part of Luke's training, he must battle the dark manifestation of the Force that resides within the cave, embodied as Darth Vader himself. The brief fight of course concludes with Luke decapitating Vader with his lightsaber, at which point Vader's helmet falls to the floor and the faceplate explodes open, revealing Luke's own severed head underneath. It's a totally haunting image which represents Luke's fear of himself succumbing to the dark side, and can also be said to visually foreshadow Empire's final familial twist. It's one of the most horrific shots in the entire Star Wars saga, but also one that'll have you examining the frame to try and figure out exactly how they pulled it off. The answer is actually rather simple though. Mark Hamill hated the prop head they were originally going to use for the scene, and so simply poked his real head up from underneath the set. That was it. Thanks for pausing your day to watch this great little Star Wars video today. Now go and tap on that subscribe button for more What Culture Star Wars fun in your life. Number 5. Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru's charred corpses, Star Wars Episode 4 A New Hope. Because severed heads apparently aren't bad enough, here's a Star Wars moment so unremittingly bleak there's a good chance you've spent decades denying that you've ever actually seen it. In A New Hope, Luke returns home and discovers that his Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru have been killed by stormtroopers. And for a few brief moments, we can also see Owen and Beru's charred corpses, melted all the way down to the skeleton after their home was set on fire. As fans, we're left to ponder precisely how Owen and Beru ended their lives. But this haunting final glimpse of the pair certainly makes it clear it was not a good death. While it's an utterly traumatic image to include in a film watched by millions of children, it's one just about every card-carrying Star Wars fan has paused at some point, no? It can't just be me, right? The morbid curiosity is overpowering, but even a prolonged stare at the burned bodies doesn't clarify whether they were shot and killed before being set afire, or were actually just burned alive. Fans are still fiercely debating it to this day, and we can only hope for the former, eh? Number 4. Mace Windu feels unlimited power, Star Wars Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith. We've previously discussed the must-pause shot from Return of the Jedi, where Anakin's strangely deformed skull is visible when he's electrocuted by the Emperor. But Revenge of the Sith offers up something of a sequel, or rather prequel, to it. Mace Windu's battle with Palpatine comes to a brutal close when Anakin slices off Windu's hand, giving Palpatine time to unleash unlimited power, hitting Windu with a sustained blast of Force lightning, as eventually sends him flying out the nearest window to his death, or apparent death depending on who you talk to. Much like Vader's electrocution in Return of the Jedi though, a freeze frame of this scene lets us take a close look at Mace Windu's traumatized skeleton. In addition to being strangely elongated much like Vader's skull, it's also clear in many frames that George Lucas's VFX team simply superimposed a rather crude basic 3D skull model over the top of Jackson's face. Even accepting that Revenge of the Sith is nearly 20 years old, it's a pretty goofy looking effect, albeit one that's tough to fully notice in regular motion, so those pause buttons simply had to be smashed. Number 3. Snokes Clones, Star Wars Episode 9 The Rise of Skywalker. There are many moments in The Rise of Skywalker that might leave you agape in sheer disappointed disbelief, though one you'll likely want to examine with a fine-tooth comb occurs in the opening minutes of the film. When Kylo Ren visits zombie Palpatine's lair on Exegol, for a few seconds we can see a large tank that appears to contain a number of clones of Supreme Leader Snoke. This ties into Palpatine's revelation to Kylo that Snoke was effectively a puppet created by him to lure Kylo to the dark side, and the visual of the tank where the Snoke clones are housed is just murky enough that you'll probably feel compelled to pause and take a closer look. While it's tough to glean much concrete from this quick shot, and it arguably only raises many more questions than it answers, it is a J.J. Abrams movie after all, it at least appears that the clones are alive in some way. Number 2. Yoda wants Luke to concentrate, Star Wars Episode 5 The Empire Strikes Back. And now for something a little less serious. We have the hilarious moment in Empire when Yoda sits on top of Luke while he performs a handstand and attempts to move some rocks with the Force. Luke eventually loses his focus, causing the rocks to fall over and Luke to lose his balance, taking Yoda to the ground with him. As Yoda falls though, he shouts "Concentrate!" as his face bears a terrified, bug-eyed expression. We get to see Yoda at his most visibly hilariously demented. eyes about ready to pop out of their sockets as he realizes he's on a collision course with the ground. While the original trilogy has its fair share of unintentionally goofy puppetry shots of Yoda, this one was obviously absolutely intended, and ridiculous enough that you'll definitely want to take a more prolonged peek. That's if you haven't replayed it 1,000 times already. I know I have. Number 1, the Death Star explosion, Star Wars Episode 4: A New Hope. And finally, who among us doesn't love marveling at a huge, awesome explosion? It's basically hardwired into us to stare slack-jawed at them, and Star Wars has regularly catered to that part of our lizard brains. While the explosion of the second Death Star in Return of the Jedi is arguably much cooler, it isn't quite as statuesque as the original superweapon's destruction in A New Hope. Seeing the Death Star suddenly explode in a gigantic fireball, complete with that unforgettable shockwave ring, is an incredible payoff to everything leading up to it, and something surely any Star Wars fan worth their salt has rewatched time and time again over the years. Fun fact for the uninitiated, the shockwave ring was actually only added in the 1997 special edition, and honestly remains one of the most inspired changes George Lucas has ever made to any Star Wars movie post-release. So cheers for that, Georgie boy!